The inkstand missed her by the width of a hand and burst against the bookcase behind her, and Margaret Fenwick did not so much as lower her book. She would remember it longest, afterward, not the noise, not even the ink crawling down old calf leather like something bleeding, but the strange, private steadiness of her own pulse while every door on the corridor behind her stood open and empty. The way rooms stand open when people have left them running. Had she known what the sitting would cost her and what it would earn her, she would have sat down all the same. They called it the Duke's Rage, in the servants' hall and in the village both, though no one still living had ever seen him strike a person. Only furniture, only glass, only the small breakable evidence of a temper that had nowhere else to go. It came, they said, once a year, always in high summer, always on the same day, and it emptied every room it touched, because sensible people learned early that a duke in that state wanted witnesses less than he wanted air. Meg had been sent up with the household accounts, because the Dowager Duchess trusted no one else to carry figures past a raging man and set them, unread, upon his desk, and Meg had done that much, and had then, instead of retreating as instructed, taken the window seat and opened her father's book, because it was the anniversary of a different man's dying. And she had long since run out of fear to spend on other people's. "You are meant to have run," the Duke said, when the ringing of the shattered inkstand had gone out of the air, and his voice was not loud at all, which she would learn later was the most dangerous thing about him. "I heard," said Meg, without looking up. "I chose the window seat instead of the door. It seemed the safer investment." He crossed the room the way a man crosses a room he intends to be alone in again shortly, and stood over her, and she felt rather than saw him take her measure, the plain gray wool, the ink-stained cuff, the book held open on her knee like a shield too small to matter. "Do you know whose room this is?" "Your Grace's," said Meg. "And I am aware that the furniture in it is not long for the world." Something moved behind his face, quick and suppressed, that she would later learn to call the beginning of a laugh he had not yet permitted himself. "You are not afraid of me." "I am not afraid of noise, sir," Meg said. "I was raised on louder silences." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look she associated afterward with men totting a column they suspected of being wrong. And then the Dowager Duchess arrived in the doorway, cane first, violet pastille and snuff announcing her a full second before her voice did, and surveyed the wreckage of the inkstand with the weary satisfaction of a woman confirming a prediction. "Ah," said Adeline, Dowager Duchess of Esmond. "Still standing, Miss Fenwick. I had wondered whether you'd have the sense to duck." "I had the sense to bring a book, ma'am. Better sense than the last 3 companions I sent up here, who came back weeping and gave notice within the week." The Duke had not moved from where he stood over the window seat, and something in his stillness made the Dowager's dry eye sharpen upon him the way it might sharpen upon a fever she had been told was passing, and did not entirely believe was passing. "Julian," she said, gentler than her usual register, "Miss, Lane writes that he will come at Michaelmas to close the trust books, 6 weeks from Monday, as your father's will requires, and I would have you well enough by then to sit across a table from him and not fall asleep in your soup. You have had that look about you again, the gray one." "I am perfectly well," the Duke said, in the flat voice of a man repeating a sentence he had grown tired of. "You are perfectly pale," said his grandmother, "which is a different arithmetic entirely, and I do not like the sum of it." She turned back to Meg with the brisk finality of a woman closing a ledger for the night. "You will come up in the afternoons and read to him, Miss Fenwick, since his eyes fail him after his physic, and he is too proud to say so above a whisper. You do not startle. That will have to serve in place of charm." Meg rose and set her father's book back into the pocket sewn along her skirt where she had always carried it, close against her hip like a second heartbeat, and did not yet know that the 6 weeks just named would be the whole shape of the story she was standing inside, or that the man watching her cross his ruined room would, before the leaves turned, owe his life to the very book she had just closed. She was back the following afternoon, and every afternoon after, and the negotiation of it happened the way most true negotiations happen, without either party quite admitting that terms were being set. "You are not paid to talk," the Duke said, on the second day, when she had corrected his pronunciation of a Latin tag in a letter from his solicitor. "I am not paid to mispronounce Mr. Lane's Latin either, Your Grace, and yet here we both are, disappointing our contracts." He did not laugh. She noted, with the same interior tally she gave to a column of figures, that he had come close. "Tell me what you are paid for then, since we are auditing. To read your correspondence when your eyes fail you in the afternoons. To keep your grandmother's household accounts, which is my proper post, and which I do rather well, though no one has thought to ask. And your name, before all that." "Fenwick," she said. "Margaret Fenwick. My friends call me Meg, though I have had little occasion, lately, to test which of my acquaintance qualify." He looked at her the way he had looked at the wreckage of the inkstand the day before, cataloging damage, and said nothing further that afternoon, which she came to understand was, for him, a form of courtesy. Her position at Esmond Park was not, in the strict accounting of the county, a position at all. She was a poor relation twice removed from gentility, the dowager's companion by charity dressed as employment, and she had come to it 3 years before by a road she did not discuss, because the road ran directly through her father's grave. Thomas Fenwick had been the district's apothecary, a careful man with careful hands, and a book of remedies he had kept since his own apprenticeship, margin notes in a cramped, exact script that recorded not merely what he prescribed, but why, and in what measure, and to whom, a habit, he used to tell her, that had saved more lives than his tinctures ever had. Because a dose remembered wrongly killed as surely as a dose given wrongly. He had died 3 years past, in disgrace and in debt, blamed by the county for the fever that had carried off the old Duke's younger grandson, a boy of 19, named Christopher Thorne. In the same season, Meg now found herself walking the same corridors his death had emptied. She had inherited nothing from her father but his book and his steadiness, and had learned in the years since to spend the second in place of the first. It was the dowager who found her, half by accident and half by the sort of deliberate kindness Adeline preferred to disguise as convenience, and installed her at Esmond Park under the plain understanding that Meg would keep the household books, read what needed reading, and ask no one for pity, an arrangement that suited them both exactly. "He does not sleep," the dowager told her, once, over the household ledger, in the flat voice she used for things that frightened her. "Not since Christopher. He rages once a year and is gray the rest of it, and Sowerby's tonics do less for him with every season, though the bills for them grow larger, which I confess I do not understand, since the man takes less exercise and eats less than a sparrow." Meg had filed that sentence away without knowing yet that it was a clue, the way one files away a stray figure in a column that does not, upon first glance, appear to be wrong. Edmund Voss found her in the Rose Walk on a soft gray morning some 10 days later, and she knew him before she saw him by the bergamot that arrived a full breath ahead of his voice, a scent so correct it seemed to have been chosen by committee. He was the old Duke's late brother's son, cousin to Julian by a connection close enough to have made him, under the terms of the will, co-trustee of the estate until Julian's 30th birthday freed it entirely into his own hands, and he wore his authority the way he wore his linen, without a crease anywhere that might catch the light wrong. "Miss Fenwick," he said. "The new reader. I hear you have quite tamed him." "I have not tamed anything, sir. I have simply declined to be frightened of a man for making noise in his own house." "A fine distinction," Voss said, smiling with his mouth only, the particular smile she would learn to recognize as his gentlest and his most dangerous, worn in equal measure. "You'll forgive an old cousin's caution. The estate has had enough disorder without a companion of uncertain family stirring the pot for her own advancement. I make it my business to know who comes and goes here. It is, after all, my business, quite literally, until Michaelmas." "Then you'll know I keep excellent accounts," Meg said, "and stir nothing I am not asked to stir." "I do hope so," he said, and touched the ring on his smallest finger, turning it once, a small, tidy gesture she would see him repeat at every moment that mattered later, though she did not know that yet. "Some men shout to be heard, Miss Fenwick. Others go quiet, and that, in my long experience, is the man you ought to watch." He left her with the smell of bergamot and the strange, unplaceable sense of having been warned about something she had not yet done, and it was 3 days after that she saw, quite by accident, laid open on the estate desk while she waited to be received, a page of Voss's own purchase ledger, an entry for physic from Mr. Sowerby larger by a factor of 3 than any sum recorded the year before, filed under a Latin name she recognized, with a small, cold jolt from the margins of her father's book, a name her father had written twice, both times beside instructions in his own careful hand about how very little of it a body could safely bear. The household had, by then, taken up the business of gossiping about the arrangement, with the frank appetite of people who had little else that summer to discuss, and Meg bore it the way she bore most things, by pretending not to hear what she heard perfectly well through half-open doors. It was in the library, 3 weeks into the reading, that the shape of the Duke's private hours revealed itself to her, because he showed her the room behind the room, a narrow chamber off the gallery, lined not with grand bindings, but with tools, awls and paste pots, and folded linen thread, where the Duke of Esmond, who could reportedly empty a hall with a look, spent his evenings mending broken spines with hands his rank had no business having. "My father taught me," he said, when he caught her staring, in the tone of a man confessing something shameful. "Before Christopher, before any of it. He said a man ought to know how to repair at least one thing with his own hands, in case the world ever asked him to prove he was good for something beyond his name." "And has it asked you yet?" "Daily," he said, and there was, for the first time since she had known him, something almost light in it. She took up a cracked spine without being invited to and began resetting the thread, because her fingers had always wanted work when her mind was working too, and he watched her do it with an attention she felt along her arms like warmth from a fire. "Your father," he said, carefully, the way a man tests ice, "was an apothecary, I think grandmother said." "He was," Meg said, and did not lift her eyes from the thread. "He is dead now." "Mine also kept a dispensary book," Julian said. "My father's fathers, from before this house had a physician on retainer at all. I have never had the courage to read it through. It was open on the desk the week Christopher died, and I have not been able to look at it since without seeing that week again." "There is a thing I cannot yet tell you," Meg said, low, surprising herself with the honesty of it, about my own father and that same season. "When I can lay it before you, you will be the first to hear it. I ask only that you let me choose the hour." He studied her for a long moment, the awl still in his hand, and did not press her, which she understood, correctly, to be its own kind of answer. "Then I will wait," he said, "though I warn you I keep poor patience," and when she looked up at that, startled by the dryness of it, she caught the very beginning of a laugh breaking loose in him at last, unguarded, quickly smothered, but entirely real. And she thought, with the same interior tally she gave to figures that finally balanced, that she would remember the sound of it for a great while. It was Voss who broke the thaw, and he did it gently, which was, she now understood, exactly his method. He came upon Julian and the Dowager at breakfast a fortnight later, with a folded paper held loosely in one hand, as though it pained him to be the bearer of it, and set it down beside the Duke's plate with the ring-turning gesture she had learned to dread. "I would not raise it," he said, "were it not a matter of the family's protection." Miss Fenwick's father, cousin, was Thomas Fenwick, the apothecary dismissed from this county for the dosing that killed poor Christopher. I have only just had it confirmed by the parish register. I do not say the daughter shares the father's error. I say only that a household newly grieved ought to know whose blood is sitting at its table each afternoon, reading its letters, keeping its books. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and cold, and Meg, entering at the worst possible moment with the day's post in her hands, felt it close over her before a single word was spoken. "Is this true?" Julian said, not looking at her, looking instead at the folded paper as though it might rearrange itself into something kinder if he stared long enough. "It is true that Thomas Fenwick was my father," Meg said. "It is not true that he erred. I have spent 3 years learning the difference, and I had hoped to prove it to you before I had to say it to you like this." "You knew," Julian said, and his voice had gone to the flat, terrible quiet she had heard once before, over a broken inkstand, and understood now to be not the absence of feeling, but its sealing. "You knew, and you sat in my workshop, and let me hand you my grief like a confidence, while you carried the other half of it in your pocket the entire time." "I was waiting for the right hour," Meg said. "You have just watched my cousin choose it for me." "A convenient waiting," Voss said softly, not looking at her at all, addressing the marmalade instead, "for a young woman whose accounts, I notice, have shown certain small irregularities in the physic ledger this quarter." "I make no accusation. I only observe that grief makes strange arithmeticians of us all." Meg felt the ground of the last 6 weeks tilt beneath her, the safety she had built out of shared work and small honesties revealed, in the space of one folded paper, to have been the very thing Voss meant to turn against her, and she understood, with the particular cold clarity of a woman watching her own asset become a weapon in someone else's hand, that her competence with the household's figures, the very thing that had made her useful, made her trusted, made her welcome in that narrow workshop with its smell of cedar and paste, had just been repointed at her own throat. The quarrel, when it came properly, came that same evening in the library, with the mended books watching from their shelves like a jury that had already voted. "I did not falsify a single figure," Meg said. "Set the ledger before Mr. Lane himself and let him find the error, if error there is." "It is not the ledger I am asking about," Julian said. "It is the 6 weeks in which you knew precisely whose daughter you were, and let me believe otherwise." "I let you believe nothing," Meg said. "I withheld one fact I was not yet ready to spend, the way you withheld your grief until you trusted me enough to hand it over." "I did not know that trust ran only one direction in this house." He did not answer that, and the not answering was its own kind of wound, and she left him standing among his mended spines with the particular composure that cost her more than tears would have, because tears, at least, would have been believed. Voss found her within the hour, in the corridor outside her small room under the eaves, and his voice, when he offered it, was gentler than she had yet heard it, which frightened her more than any shout could have. "I have spoken to the Dowager," he said. "There need be no scandal in this. A reference, generous, and a sum to see you comfortably settled elsewhere, Bath, perhaps, or your mother's people in the north, wherever you like, on the single condition that the matter of your father's dosing, and of this quarter's physic accounts, is never raised again by you, to anyone, for any reason. It is, I think, a fair price for your silence, and rather more than the county gave your father. You are asking me to sell the only thing I have left of him, Meg said. I am asking you to be sensible, Voss said, which is a kindness, though you may not recognize it as one. Then I decline your kindness, Meg said. And I will keep my father's name unsold, whatever it costs me here, and she watched something flicker behind Voss's immaculate composure, gone before she could name it, the ring turning once more upon his finger as he inclined his head and left her standing in the dark of the corridor with her decision, and its price entirely her own. The price came due within the week. She was called before the Dowager and the Duke both, in the same library where she had learned to love the sound of Julian's rare laugh, and dismissed with a formality that felt, to her, like a door closing on a room she had only just begun to think of as her own. Julian did not meet her eyes at all, and the Dowager's, when Meg dared to look, were bright and furious and entirely unable to countermand her grandson in front of him. I will pack tonight, Meg said, and go in the morning, and she did not weep, because weeping, she had long ago decided, was a currency she preferred not to spend where it could be misread as a plea. Adeline caught her on the stair before dawn, came silent for once against the runner, and pressed something into her hand without a word, a duplicate key to the estate strongbox, and a folded note that said only, in a spidery, furious script, "Find what he's hiding, and come back before Michaelmas, or I shall never forgive either of you." Meg took the mail coach as far as the Crossroads Inn, meaning to go no farther that day than her own grief allowed, and it was there, waiting out a summer storm under the inn's low eaves, that she found Mr. Sowerby the apothecary already 3 glasses into an unhappy evening, his hands shaking in a way she recognized from her father's descriptions of a man dosing himself past his own good sense. "You've no cause to look at me so," he said, when he saw her, guilt written plain across a face too honest to hide it. "I only measure what I'm told to measure. Mr. Voss brings the order. I fill the bottle. That's the whole of my part in it, and I'll thank you not to say different to anyone who asks." "No one has asked you anything yet, Mr. Sowerby," Meg said, very quietly, setting her own glass down untouched, "but I find I am about to." He did not answer her that night, frightened back into silence by his own slip, but she rode back toward Esmond Park the next morning, with her father's book open on her knee against the coach's jolting, reading the margin notes she had read 100 times before with new and terrible attention, and she did not yet know whether 6 days would be enough to prove what she now suspected, or whether the Duke of Esmond would still be alive, or willing to hear her. When she arrived, she went first to the Dowager, and found in her an ally sharpened rather than softened by the intervening days, and together, over the strongbox key and 2 cold cups of tea, they built the shape of what needed doing. "He turns 30 on the last day of the quarter," Adeline said, "and if he is not fit to sit across from Mr. Otterit Lane and sign for himself, the trust does not simply extend, child, it converts, entire, into Edmund's hands, as guardian of the next heir in line, a boy of 9 in Yorkshire who has never set foot on this land, which means Edmund would hold Esmond Park in all but name for the better part of 20 years. My grandson's failing health is not incidental to that clause. It is the whole of Edmund's arithmetic." Meg laid her father's book on the table between them, open to the pages she had marked, and beside it the ledger page she had once glimpsed on Voss's desk, copied out from memory into her own careful hand, and the 2 columns, set side by side, told a story that needed no further ornament, a purchase 3 times any prescribed dose, and beneath it, in her father's script from 3 years gone, the exact fatal measure he had refused to give a dying boy and had been ruined for refusing. "Sowerby will crack," Meg said, "if he is asked the right question in front of the right witnesses, because he is a frightened man, not a wicked one, and frightened men want, more than anything, to stop being afraid alone. Then we shall arrange for him to stop being afraid alone on Michaelmas Eve," the Dowager said, at dinner before Mr. Lane and half the county, under cover of celebrating a birthday Edmund never expected my grandson to see. And it was Arabella Quince, of all people, cold, polished Arabella, who had spent the summer angling for Julian's title with a diligence Meg had once resented, who came to Meg's door that same evening pale and shaking, having pieced together on her own account exactly what her fashionable cousin Voss had been buying, and why, and offered, quietly, at real cost to her own prospects, to swear before the room what she had seen him do with his own hand to the household's medicine chest not 3 nights before. Voss himself, encountering Meg unexpectedly restored to the breakfast table the next morning, said nothing at all, only turned his ring once, twice, a third time. His composure for the first time in the whole long summer showing at its very edge the thinnest hairline crack. The storm that had followed Meg home from the crossroads broke properly on Michaelmas Eve, thunder walking the roof of Esmond Park like something pacing, and the dining room stood full when she came in behind the Dowager Mr. Lane, with his spectacles and his patient trustee's face, Arabella pale and upright at her mother's side, Sowerby wedged between 2 footmen who had orders to be gentle and immovable both, and Julian at the head of the table, thinner than he had been in June, his hand closing slowly around the stem of a glass he had not yet drunk from. Voss rose to greet her with the old bergamot smoothness fully restored, as though nothing in 6 weeks had cracked at all. "Miss Fenwick returns to us," he said. "How touching, and how timely, on the eve of the very audit that concerns her former patron's fitness to sign his own name." "I have come to settle an account, Mr. Voss," Meg said, "which is, I think, rather your own province than mine." And she set her father's book upon the table, open, and beside it the copied ledger page, and let the room's silence do the first part of her work for her. "My father," she said into that silence, "was blamed 3 years ago for the death of Christopher Thorne, and dismissed and broken for prescribing what the county was told was a fatal dose. Here, in his own hand, is the dose he actually gave, the safe one, the correct one, the smallest that would answer. And here," she turned the ledger page toward the candlelight, "is a purchase, in Mr. Voss's own hand, of 3 times that measure, made not 3 years ago, but 3 months ago, and renewed monthly since. A coincidence of Latin," Voss said, smiling with his mouth only, "and a grieving girl's arithmetic." "Then let us ask the man who filled the bottles," Meg said, and turned to Sowerby, whose hands had begun to shake again exactly as they had at the Crossroads Inn. "Mr. Sowerby, who instructed you to increase his grace's dose each month, and did you ever once see a physician's order for it in writing?" The room held its breath the way a held breath holds itself, and Sowerby's composure, thin already, went the rest of the way at that single precise question, and he put his face in his hands and said, in a voice gone entirely to pieces, that there had been no order, only Mr. Voss's word each time, and a letter, once, that he had been told to burn and had not, out of a coward's instinct to keep something back against a day exactly like this one. He drew it, creased and smoke-stained at one corner, from inside his coat, and Mr. Lane read it aloud in the dry, exact voice of a man who has spent his whole career reading things aloud that other men would rather he did not, Voss's own hand, naming the increase, naming the reason, protection of the trust, in terms too plain for any drawing room to survive. Voss did not deny it. He stood very still instead, the ring turning one final time upon his finger, and something in his face gave way that was not guilt exactly, but a long, private grief finally let off its leash, for a father passed over, a branch of the family always second, a house he had grown to believe should by rights have been his, and never was. And for one unguarded moment, the whole room saw not a villain, but a man who had spent a decade mistaking envy for arithmetic. Julian rose at last, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than the thunder outside and carried further than any shout could have. "You will leave England within the fortnight," he said, "with an allowance sufficient to live, and not 1 shilling more, and you will never set foot on this land again. I do this not for mercy's sake toward you, cousin, though I find, God help me, I do not wholly wish you dead. I do it because a trial would drag Christopher's name through every paper in the kingdom, and I have buried him once already. That is a grief I decline to spend twice." Then he turned to Meg, and before the whole assembled room, said the thing she had waited 3 years to hear someone of standing say aloud: "Thomas Fenwick gave my brother the correct dose, and was ruined for another man's greed. I clear his name here, before these witnesses, as the very first act of my 30th year, and the room that had emptied so easily all summer stood entirely, unmistakably full." He found her afterward in the narrow workshop off the gallery, the storm settling into ordinary rain against the glass, and she was sitting, as she had been the very first day, in the window seat, a book open on her knee, though this time it was one of his own mended volumes rather than her father's. "I owe you an apology longer than any speech I know how to make," Julian said, "and I find I would rather earn my way back to you than talk my way back, if you will permit the difference." "You may begin," Meg said, "by telling me what you intend to do with your newly unencumbered 30th year." "Marry, if the lady will have me," he said. "Though I want to be plain that I am not asking out of gratitude, or relief, or any accounting a solicitor could enter in a ledger. I am asking because a woman once sat in this room while I threw an inkstand at the wall, and did not run, and I have not once in all the weeks since stopped wanting her not to run from anything else, either. Marry me, because you wish it, Meg. It is the only reason I will take." "A room is only empty if you let it be," Meg said, giving him back, word for word, the thing she had told him on her very first afternoon in that house, and watched the whole of his careful reserve come undone at last into the unguarded laugh she had been quietly collecting since June. They were married in October, quietly, in the small stone chapel at the edge of the park, with no more than 30 souls present and the dowager weeping with a thoroughness she loudly denied for the rest of her life. Arabella stood as witness and, within the year, found in a widowed magistrate 2 counties, over a match rather better suited to her than any duke, and wrote to Meg often, and warmly, of it. Sowerby, dismissed but not disgraced, was granted a small practice on the coast, on the private condition that Meg's father's book be copied into his own before he left, so that no measure taken from it would ever again be misread. Voss went abroad, and was heard of only twice more, both times in letters to his aunt, both times signed, without irony, "Your grieving cousin," and the dowager kept every one of them in a drawer she never opened, but never threw away either. Mr. Lane closed the trust books at last on a bright, ordinary morning and pronounced them, for once in his long career, entirely to his satisfaction. It was the following August, a full year turned, that Meg came upon her husband exactly as she had found him first, alone in his study, the window open. a single blackbird working through its evening song in the elm outside, except that this time the room was not empty at all, but full of their small son asleep against his father's chest, and every chair long since claimed by people who loved them both. And Julian looked up at her over the boy's dark head and said, "Sit down, wife. I have a book I have been saving to read to you." And Meg crossed the room that had once emptied itself for a stranger's grief, and sat and thought, listening to the blackbird finish its song outside the glass, that some rooms are only ever empty until someone chooses to sit down in them and open a book and stay. If this story warmed you, the particular warmth of watching someone refuse to run and be loved for the staying rather than in spite of it, then pull your chair a little nearer the fire, because there is a kettle on and a place kept, and I am not nearly done telling stories like this one. Tell me, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest, the inkstand striking the wall and Meg never lowering her book, or Julian at the very end asking her simply to sit. I read every one of them by this same fire. If you would like to be here the next time a room fills up like this, stay a while and subscribe, and keep your own chair by the hearth for whenever the next story is ready to be told. Until then, sleep well and be gentle with the ones who never once ran from you.